Yeah.
This meeting is being recorded.
What?
Is that your mom?
Yeah.
Hi, hi, mom.
Why?
Hi, Mary. No,
Okay.
Janet?
probably.
Welcome, friends. Hello, friends. Welcome. Thank you for making the time tonight. We're thrilled to have Dr. Amy Frykholm with us. We like to celebrate when friends complete book projects and give them a chance. And this one, I feel particularly
You should feel very
celebratory.
attached to this one. Yeah.
Amy is a literary anthropologist, a journalist, a culture critic, an author of how many nonfiction books now?
Six,
6.
maybe, and one book of poetry.
A book of poetry, and now a novelist. It's official.
The most exciting one. That's really the most exciting.
And we're Amy and I met at a writers' conference. How many years ago?
10,
7?
11?
11?
No, I guess it was maybe 2015.
Yeah, so 10.
9 or 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
At my alma mater, and I was rooming with the other Jewish person at the conference.
They're Jewish man.
It
There
was-
were other Jewish women, I think. There were.
Oh, yeah,
there's
that's right,
only
that's right.
one other Jewish
One
man.
other Jewish man at a conference for writing for clergy. And he was from Israel Orthodox, and he was disgruntled every day until the day that he went to Amy's workshop, and he came back raving, "That is the best. Well, I made the whole trip worth it coming from Israel." And I was like, "I gotta meet this woman." And we found ourselves they had me help facilitate a Friday night thing, and I sat down at a high table and introduced myself, and it turned out to be Amy Frykholm, famous. When we found out that we were
Just down the road
Coloradans,
for each
just down the
other.
road,
Yeah.
Amy's in Leadville, that we both confessed that we were aspiring novelists, and we said, let's start a writing group. And I said, I know a few novelists in the congregation, I can rope them in, Joanne Greenberg and Ron Solomon and Diane Mott Davidson. So these are
And then we got Marilyn.
And we got Marilyn Salzman to join us, yes, and
Steve Posner.
Steve Posner has been there too. Yeah, so we've been meeting every month for 10 years.
Almost 9 years.
9
yeah.
years, and so
So yeah, so what I have a lot to thank Beth Evergreen for actually, because when I brought this novel to the Beth Evergreen writing group, I had just gotten word from a mentor that he was like, I think it needs a total rewrite from the top, from only one perspective and in chronological order. So he basically, and I'd been working on it, but at that point I'd been working on it for 10 years. So it was it's kind of a big deal to hear. And I remember at that conference walking around and around with another person at the conference, just trying to think that through, like, really? Like, is it true that I don't have a novel yet and that I have to start from the beginning? But, the great thing that happened then was that this writing group opened up. And so I was able to bring that draft as I started to create it to this place and get the encouragement and get the kind of, yeses, some real clear yeses and nos that I needed to hear from people. And so that evolved into this novel. So I'm really grateful to Beth Evergreen. I also want to say thank you to Beth Evergreen, because in the novel, the priest is translating the Psalms, and as you know, so is Rabbi Jamie. And so and also I also had Joanne Greenberg in the group. And so we talked a lot about Hebrew, not just because of my novel, but just because it was natural to the conversation. So I was able to kind of like check myself and like see if I was getting anywhere, and test out any objections and all that kind of stuff as he was working through the Psalm. So that was cool. And then furthermore, I also have a daily Musar practice that I would not have if I had not encountered Rabbi Jamie and Beth Evergreen. So I'm really grateful for all of that, and for all of you, and for that support and help. So thank you for being here tonight. And yeah, so I wanted to start with an image from the novel, but also from my experience. So when I was in the late stages of writing this novel, I went on a road trip with my son, who was, I think he was about 17 at that time. So he and I drove up to South Dakota, and we drove to the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which was the place that I had in my imagination as I eventually renamed the reservation Windy Creek, because I didn't want anybody trying to map out exactly where I was. But in my mind, it was Rosebud. And I wanted to check out certain aspects of my imagination against the reality that my memory. And so one of the places that was on my itinerary was the St. Francis Mission School, which I knew that I was kind of writing about or writing around, and I wanted to kind of see it again and really just experience it. And it's closed now, and the tribe has opened up another school that's kind of behind the property where St. Francis Mission School was. St. Francis Mission School was opened in 1886, I think, and closed or was turned over to the tribe in 1974. So it was almost 100 years that it existed in that place. And so when I drove up to the campus, it's like, it is a campus. It's really it's off of a rural highway, and then it's kind of a wide open space, but there are also some really tall trees there. It's very evergreen, kind of spruce trees, I think, or something. And then the first building you come to is a little museum, and it's a really nice museum with contemporary art and some history and some geology and some just kind of ways to interact with the reservation. So it was a super nice place to kind of enter. And I had this really interesting conversation with a woman there, and I asked her about the school and if she had gone there, and a mask just went down on her face. Just a mask appeared out of nowhere. And it was clear that she was not going to interact with me about the school. And she said, yeah, I went there. It was a good experience. I had a very good experience. And that was it. And I could tell that this was not an interview. She was not going to talk with me about this. I think she said that 3 generations of her family had gone to that school. So, I mean, for her, I could tell that there was, first of all, that a lot of people perhaps had been coming and asking questions, and that she wasn't too happy about that. And also that she felt a great deal of defensiveness, even, or like a sense of pride and investment. And her family had invested 3 generations in this school. And that was it. That was the end of that conversation. And then I walked outside, and there are 2 buildings that are kind of back to back. And both of them are abandoned. So they have not been torn down, but so one of them was where the priests lived, and one of them was where was the dormitory. And then I don't really know, the rest of it. But they were both abandoned, and they had this look. So they would have been abandoned since roughly 1974. I don't know. They had this look of haunting to them. Like haunting. Yeah, they looked haunted. They felt haunted, and they felt like they were haunting the rest of the reservation. They felt like nobody wanted to deal with them. They were not being cared for in any way. Clearly, there were broken windows, boarded up windows, graffiti. There was a lot of trash. So no one was caring for them, but also no one was like removing them, right? So there was a sense that they needed to be there, and that people were still in some very strange way connected to them, but then also, and to me, it kind of became this image of generational trauma, which were not words that anybody had in 1974 when they abandoned that school and they opened up a new campus. But for me, that became kind of an image of that haunting, that way that the past doesn't, stay past. And I guess we'll talk a little bit about that as I go forward here. But anyway, so I did run across some interesting history just to give you a little more context about the reservation. So when I say that the St. Francis Mission School was established in 1886, that was actually 3 years before the Rosebud Reservation was established. So it was there before the Rosebud, but what was there was what they called the Great Sioux Reservation. So everything west of the Missouri River, which bifurcates the state, everything west was called the Great Sioux Reservation. But then in 1874, gold was found in the Black Hills, and the US government was not interested in allowing the Sioux to have the entire western half of the state. So they what's called the Great Partition, they partitioned it, and one of the pieces that they broke off was the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which was for the Lakota tribe. So there are three major Native American tribes in South Dakota. There's the Dakota tribe, there's the Lakota tribe, and then there's the Yankton tribe. And so those are the three major divisions of what was called the Sioux in the 19th century. So it was clear that these buildings hadn't been touched since 1974, but it was also true that there was something important about them. So I had actually encountered these buildings before. Like when I went there, I knew I'd encountered them before through these letters. And I'd seen them in my mind's eye, but now I could kind of see them in reality. So from the very beginning, when I started researching this book, I didn't have these words then either, but my subject really was generational trauma, even though I didn't have language for that, and generational resilience. So I had met this little girl in Sioux Falls, and she had become a friend. She was about 8 years old. I was about 18 years old, 18 or 19. And we just developed this sweet friendship. And one thing that struck me about her was her incredible resilience, this amazing 8-year-old with an incredible sense of herself and an kind of indomitable spirit. You know, if you've worked ever with children who come from traumatic backgrounds, I don't know if you feel this way, but I've sort of felt like I could almost sort them. Make it, won't make it, make it, won't make it, make it, won't make it. Like there's sometimes there's a spirit in the child that you just see and you're like, that world cannot overcome you. You are too much. And I felt like that she was one of those. And of course, she needed every single bit of that resilience to survive her childhood. Her mother was a wonderful sprite, like of a woman. I loved her. But she had this cackly laugh. Like she would just go off, and she had this incredible sense of humor. Could not walk into the room without her making fun of you in some sort of wonderful way. Like she was one of those people who could see you for who you are, figure out where your little weak spot was, and then tease you about it, but then not too much, so that you felt offended, but just sort of, she just was like that. And she loved her daughter, and her daughter loved her, and they lived on and off in a car. And then kind of in anything that could be begged or borrowed. I mean, anything, just, and so they lived together in the car, and she was an alcoholic, and she often would put her daughter in situations of incredible danger. And so, this was the little girl that inspired this novel and inspired my research. So my writing started as an attempt to tell the story of these two really complicated human beings, who I also had grown to love. But I was very young when I met them, and I moved away pretty quickly from Sioux Falls. And so as the years went by, I had to find my way back to them imaginatively. I couldn't just call Celeste and be like, so tell me, about your life as an alcoholic. Like I didn't have those skills. I didn't know how to reach her. I didn't know really anything about her. And in fact, she died not terribly long after her daughter was adopted by a family. And soon after that, she died. And so I didn't actually have the opportunity. So that forced me to trace kind of historical and geographical threads as I tried to imagine their stories and tried to kind of follow the thread to see where I could find them. And that led me to the Rosebud Indian Reservation. And so at that point, I was researching Rosebud, and I was researching the St. Francis Mission, and I found, I don't know how to say that, how differently. I don't mean that I discovered these. They were there, but they had been in the early 2000s, these letters that were between priests who worked at the St. Francis Mission School and the Diocese of Rapid City, were published by survivors and former students in the school. And the internet was really had just started. So I was able to find them online. When I first started researching this novel, I had to do everything from South Dakota, and everything had to be in, public forums, like newspapers, or, I would go to the library and I would do all this research in newspapers, but you couldn't get anything online. That just wasn't a thing. And so the discovery of these letters for me was really transformative. And really the students the former students who made these letters public have become part of a national movement that really is about the healing from the boarding school movement in the United States and the boarding schools for Indigenous people. So I have to say that I knew about clergy sexual abuse in an abstract way. I knew about it. I had heard about it. There were lots of stories in the culture about it. I had never intended to write about it. And really my feeling became, and I remember discussing this in the group too, like, well, do you go this way or do you not go this way? And my feeling eventually became to not write about clergy sexual abuse in light of the stories that I'm trying to tell in this novel would be like trying to write about the Jim Crow South and being like, well, let's just not mention that, those nasty laws. We'll just skip over that part, right? Like I realized that I couldn't do that. Of course not. Like this is the context. This is the root. This is the generational trauma that my characters had in their history and in their background and in their reality. And so it was tempting, to be like, well, I don't really want to deal with that. But then to realize that I couldn't go that way, that I had to confront them. And I found these letters stunning. They were shocking to me. I couldn't believe how openly they were discussing sexual abuse but without the words. They didn't use sexual abuse for sure. That word was not present. They didn't use even the little older word, molestation. They didn't use that word. They didn't use words, but still it was so obvious what they were talking about. And I couldn't believe that they were there. It was something I still struggle to make sense of. So, when I faced those buildings, I saw the letters in this new light because, the back door to the one building and the front door to the other building, just a couple 100 yards apart.
So where the priest lived.
Where the priest lived to the dormitory.
He had
And
easy
And the
access.
basement, right? The basement had these windows that were all broken out. But suddenly it was like not just some abstract basement, like the idea of a basement. It was right there. This was the place where the children were taken. And it changed everything to sort of put those pieces into my mind. And so I just thought I'd read just a little bit of where I tried to translate that into Father Joe's experience, Father Joe being the main character of the book, who begins to try to make sense of these things himself. Words, this is after Father Joe himself finds these letters. Words flitted in and through his consciousness. These weren't ordinary words. They were charged, lit, panties, basement, nice talk. He pictured that basement of the school as it was now. Windows smashed out, trash scattered across its floor, abandoned, hulking, and haunted. Everyone had moved on to the new school, but no one had moved on at all. No wonder. But he didn't have other words. He couldn't replace them with anything that could explain it. So that was my attempt to kind of allow him to have this experience, and also then to allow myself to have it, because there's a way that I struggled to have that experience. And I just want to talk about that a little bit more as we talk about generational trauma. So as I pieced together the various stories of the characters in this novel, I could not escape the fact that these were people who had experienced something they couldn't name. They didn't have a language for. And so when we talk about how nobody talked about it in the culture, or after publishing this book, I've talked to so many people who were like, oh yeah, we had one of those priests in my whatever, right? I just want to grapple with the fact that sometimes there aren't words for people to say what was happening. They don't even know. And a lot of people that I've talked to seem to have this idea of like, everyone knew and no one knew. It was everywhere and it was nowhere. It was infiltrated and yet absent.
Mhm.
And so I think that that is part of this haunting, right? That's kind of how we think of ghosts. They're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So what words did they have? This bothered me a lot in writing this novel. Like, what words would he have had? What so I started to do some research, and I did come across that word molest, which was this word from, it started only in the 20th century. Did it start to mean anything sexual? Did it become a euphemism for sexual harassment? Basically is what it became a euphemism for, what we call now sexual harassment or sexual abuse. But when you don't have a word for something, it's very easy to look away from it. And for a long time, that's exactly what our culture did, right? They just went, I don't see that. That is not present, and moved on and went on. And Father Joe, what I struggled with a lot was that, how would Father Joe have experienced that? How would he have known but not known? How would he have lived with that and perpetuated a culture that allows it, right? But that focuses, what really boggled me in the letters is how everybody focuses on the well-being and health of the perpetrators. So they know that these men are sick. And so they focus on how to make them well, which is an interesting pursuit, right? But in the complete absence of their victims. So they're focused on, they understand that something is wrong, but they aren't thinking at all about the children who are in contact with these men. That is not part of the calculation. And how could you do that? And so anyway, here's Father Joe struggling on the very first page of the novel with something that he doesn't understand and he doesn't have words for. And so he constantly revisits it in his mind. It's kind of how I imagined it. So this is Father Joe had come down from the rectory after his morning shave and coffee, hooking his collar as he walked over frozen mud. He was a big man who rambled like a bear, little off balance, but not without purpose. In his head, he was deeply engaged in conversation with Father Fabian, the principal of the reservation school, about a problem he hoped the man would address. He had tried this speech out directly to Father Fabian and hadn't gotten it right. Now he was endlessly revising, trying again and again. It was important, extremely important, but whenever he approached the man, whether in reality or in his head, he didn't get it right. His words fell flat. They had no effect. And so that was me trying to imagine what it was like to try to intervene in culture when you don't have any words that penetrate the problem. But then I had to struggle with something in myself, and that is that I didn't feel like I could feel the trauma of these children. I didn't know how to let that into myself. I felt this frozenness, honestly, just this kind of, it couldn't get below the surface of my life. And that bothered me a lot because I do have words, right? So if I think the solution is to have the words, then I was encountering in myself this kind of stuck place, this frozenness around the pain of these children. And I remember when I was a junior in college, I took a course on the Holocaust with a professor, Steve Polanski, and he was trained by the Facing History in Ourselves Foundation to teach about the Holocaust. And they had some really specific ideas about how to go about this and why you would invite students into an experience like that. I'm not sure they still do it today, honestly, because it was really intense. And what they did in that class, what we did in that class was layer image over image over image, and feeling over feeling over feeling, and horror over horror over horror, until you were absolutely just wiped out emotionally. At least I was. I have this visceral perception of the Holocaust that I don't have about any other historical event. And I don't have it about the boarding schools. I don't have it. And I think that I would probably have a similar frozenness in relation to the Holocaust if I had not had that class. But now, because I have that image after image after image, that layering, layering, and layering of feeling and horror and that visceral perception, I feel like I carry to that event a different orientation than I do to these boarding schools and to these children. I still can't quite get my mind or my heart around this at all. And I have this really interesting person who's been emailing me, who works with the Jesuit school now on the Rosebud Indian Reservation. And he immediately perceived that I was talking about St. Francis Mission School, even though I'd renamed it or whatever. He didn't care. He knew exactly what I was talking about. And he's been sending me historical photos from the school. Especially so the priests, one of the ones he sent me that is really interesting, is about how the priests used to bake bread there at the school. And you have to remember that children were starving. Their families, the ways that their families had of making a living, of getting money, of buying food, had been absolutely eviscerated. There was no food. The children were starving. And the priests would bake fresh bread at the school. And the children would line up, and they called it bun time. And they would have each got their own little fresh bun. And he sent me some pictures, historical photos of the priests handing out those buns. And I've always had this perception that they're just these, it's almost like two tectonic plates next to each other. And one of them is this incredible care and love when no one else would go, no one else would be there. And the other one is this abuse and this violence and this unspeakable. And those two things are lined up right next to each other in an earthquake in between. And so that is something that I've really been struggling with in myself. And I guess I'd like to make that part of our conversation. And that's kind of where I'm going, is like some things that we could talk about, in this group, about this, because I don't consider myself in any way an expert on this subject. I've just been exploring it within my imagination and trying to feel my way through it, and not always being super successful. So I wondered about how these things are spoken about in families. For example, if anyone in your family has experience of the Holocaust, or if there's generational trauma in your family, what words, what language, what came up, what didn't? I have a feeling like for the little girl and her mother that I talked about at the beginning, that they didn't talk about this at all. There was nothing there, nothing that was shared between them on this subject. But I don't know that for sure. And I am in contact with the little girl, and one of these days I'm going to ask her, but I just feel like, in our first like reacquaintance conversations, I feel like bringing this up right away. But I wonder about any attempts that you all have made to feel your way into these historical realities. And then I guess I was thinking about how in this country we live alongside these historical traumas. I'm really thinking about South Dakota, because in South Dakota, we lived side by side with the slaughter that had taken place less than 100 years before we were there. And yet there was no evidence of it in any way, no mention of it, nothing, absolute absence. So kind of that absence presence, that kind of ghostly thing. There's a lot going on now in this country and in Canada around these issues. There's a lot of when I look into what a lot of these schools and survivors and and former students are doing, they're doing a lot of really interesting metaphoric and symbolic work around this, knowing somehow that ritual and symbol are ways that they can maybe begin to reconstruct and understand the past, and that's sitting alongside things like finding graveyards with hundreds of little bodies in them, those kinds of things. They're sitting alongside those things, but trying to engage them in some metaphoric practices and some symbolic practices and ritual practices that I think is really interesting. And certainly when I was growing up in South Dakota, there was just nothing like that. And I think my own experience of feeling that emotional bluntness, that like, I can't penetrate this, comes a lot from growing up in a context where it was everywhere and nowhere all at the same time. And so I've been thinking about that. And then I was meditating on the saying in the Hebrew Bible about how the iniquity of the fathers will be visited on the children, and what that actually means. So I kind of wanted to end with that and just what I was thinking about in relation to that. And then I'd love to hear what you all might be thinking about that. So in the text, at least the first time in Exodus, when this is first mentioned, it's mentioned several times. It's almost like it was a ritual repeating, that it must have been a part of the culture. People must have said it with some frequency. And really, so what it says is that God will visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. So that's how it puts it. And I thought, this is really actually, I think maybe an attempt to talk about what we now call generational trauma. So for starters, for my own sake, I took God's agency out. I just took the agency of God out. So it says God will visit this upon the children. But I thought, well, let's just, for a thought experiment, just say, this is actually a descriptive statement, not a prescriptive one. Let's imagine that's a descriptive statement, not a prescriptive one. So it's unequivocally true that the sins and horrors of the past visit us to the third and fourth generation. This is a statement of fact. We see this, we know how this goes. We can think of William Faulkner, where he says, the past is never dead. It's not even past. All of us labor in webs spun long before we were born. Webs of heredity and environment, of desire and consequence, of history and eternity. And even now, now we even talk about it in scientific terms, right? We know that like epigenetically, that these things come and live in our DNA and then can be stimulated by the environment. I still find that quite mysterious, but I think we're pretty sure that this is how it works, that you can pass on trauma from generation to generation through your genes, not by even doing one single thing. And if that's not how the fathers visit the children from one generation to another, then I don't know how else to talk about it. And certainly the mothers as well. But what's interesting too is that in Exodus, that particular phrase is also found in the very same chapter, at least in my Bible, as the Ten Commandments, which of course include the honor your mother and father. So we both have the visiting of these kind of past horrors and the honoring, and they're in the same, within a couple of verses of each other. They're right there, sitting side by side. And I was thinking about Aviva Zornberg, and how she points out that a lot of these passages are written as if they're about future generations, but they're being written toward the past. So it's like the fourth generation is writing as if they were the first generation, and then talking forward to the fourth, like to themselves, but from the past. Does that make sense? Like, so it's about the past in a future tense. That's basically how I understood that. And so it's the later generation reflecting on this space between what happened with the fathers and now what's happening with them, and saying that the sins of the fathers have been visited upon them, actually. And so they're noticing that. And I thought that that's a really interesting question, or something we can wonder about, like what reflection can we do? What's available to us in this generation to think about what happened 3 or 4 generations ago? And how can we then also structure? I think that the desire maybe of that generation reflecting on the past was to create something better, for the next generation was like, if this is true, if we're suffering because of what happened to our fathers 4 generations ago, what can we do now so that our 4th generation out won't suffer? Something like that. And so I think that's a really interesting question for us as well, especially as a child of South Dakota, as a child of that place where everybody was like, yeah, how about we just forget about that? And we'll just leave that alone for a while. And my people have done a pretty poor job of reflecting on the sins of the past. I mean, I can tell you, they've done a really poor job. So I'm wondering about that, on how we live now. And so I thought I would read just one little piece more about my controversial, this is a little controversial, this little passage, at least I found out recently that it was. This is about this, it takes place through the eyes of Alice, who is one of the Lakota characters in the novel. And she's a person who has really taken history into her bones, and she's this kind of in-between generation. She's suffered a great deal. She's trying to create something better for the future. And she's in Sioux Falls now. And they're walking around. Sioux Falls is not her hometown. So Sioux Falls is on the east side of the state, and she's from the western side of the state, but lots of her relatives end up in Sioux Falls. Let's see. Meat. So what's that smell? Bear asked as they walked. Meat packing, Father Joe said. There's a big plant up there. He gestured north, finding it odd that he was becoming the tour guide for a Sioux Falls he only barely knew. Yet they knew it less, he realized. Alice had gone into a fog. That smoky look she'd had after Albert's death had returned to her eyes. She was quiet. He remembered that she had a brother who'd done time in the penitentiary here, and that she used to come home from visiting him with something she called river sick. Sioux Falls for her was a place where only the despairing went. You came here when you lost your connection, when you gave up on Windy Creek and the demands the land made. Then a little bit later, she and Father Joe are talking, and she gestures at the rock that the Sioux Falls is made out of. It's made out of this Sioux quartzite. It's this red, beautiful, beautiful red or maroon-like stone. Do you know about the rock, Father? What rock? The rock that this whole town is made out of. The whites call it Sioux quartzite, and they built everything out of it. The courthouse and the museum and the high school, even the penitentiary. But for us, that rock is sacred. It has the blood of our ancestors in it. It's the rock that protects Pipestone, the most sacred rock in the world. When I'm here, all I can think about is all that blood. It's almost like I hear them crying. She shivered and looked out into the nearing dark. You're going to leave us, she said finally, as she pulled herself awake and shook something off. So, yeah. So
Why is it controversial?
because, well, I kind of made up that about the rock. I mean, it's true that it protects the quartzite. And so that part's true, but it is the rock that sits around the pipestone. So that part is true. But I was trying to find a way to express the way that rock exists in the white mind is like, it's just rock. But in her mind, it's never, ever, ever just rock. It's an expression of the land that is an expression of the people, that is expression of the people who came from the land. And so people in Sioux Falls who've grown up around this rock and praised themselves for the beauty of it or whatever, haven't really liked so far my take on it. So that's the only reason that it's controversial. Anyway, so I just wanted to return to the woman and the child that I started with, that these were people who were carrying this history around in their bodies, living it, walking the streets with it, trying to find meaning and hope and healing. So what happened to the little girl in the real world is that she was adopted by a family. Her mother died soon after, and she really felt like she caused her mother's death. You know, she felt like being separated from her mother, like there was a bond between them. And when that bond was broken, her mother's existence ceased to have meaning, ceased to have power. And so she felt that she caused her mother's death. And that gave her a lot of pain, obviously, and just the separation and the trauma she experienced. But she did have a much easier life. I mean, she wasn't much safer. She was surrounded by loving people. I remember visiting her and her new home and, being surrounded by toys and books and plush carpet and stuffed animals, and kind of a whole safe world. But anyway, she got pregnant as a young woman and she gave birth to a daughter who she named after her mother. And this year in May, that little girl is graduating from high school. And when she speaks of the life that she and her daughter had together, she just speaks with incredible pride, and about the struggle that they endured, about what it was like for them. But, they made it through. And I would say that, the upbringing she gave her daughter was much better than the upbringing that her mother was able to give her, and much better than that mother was able to give to her daughter, and so on. And the daughter, who carries her grandmother's name, is now the 4th generation of the children of Rosebud. So.
And hopefully the last of inherited trauma.
And maybe that's what I'm kind of wondering. I mean, of course, we all inherit a lot of things, but I think that there is a way, just speaking with her, that I feel that maybe history is lifting a bit from her shoulders, the way that it never could from her mother's.
I'm curious, was she adopted by a family that recognized her Native American background?
I mean, they knew about it, but it wasn't something that they really invested in. They were much more interested. They were Baptists, they were much more interested in her salvation. And, and I think very well-meaning people, but I always felt something was lost. And of course, I mean, they were doing the best. Everyone was doing the best they knew how to do. And this girl she was 8 years old. She was constantly in places that were very scary, very dangerous. So I get it, it's not a blame thing, but she was quite separated from both her mother and from her history and background.
So she probably didn't really know anything at that point about the trauma that took place in the.
No, she would have known nothing, or in her mother's life. I mean, I don't think she was separated from her mother at age 8. I don't think her mother had a lot of time to tell her stories or, to really give her a lot of background. So anything she's done on her own. She told me that whenever she starts to write, I joked with her that maybe the sequel to this book is hers, not mine. And she said, yeah, I am a writer, she said. And every time I go to write about my history and my family, I just end up writing in poetry. And so that's interesting to me too.
I'm really interested in the sort of craft of narrating a story, a history, in a way that we can avoid the blockage you talked about, right? That we can feel the pain of it without sort of getting defensive or putting on the mask or delving into shame and anger, and right, just in terms of thinking of it in terms of this history and the history of anti-Black racism, and the Day of American Day of Atonement that we're kind of a couple weeks from now, like is essentially that, like, how do we, without prompting or reactionary to critical race theory or something like that. So the putting it in the novel.
Yeah.
I mean, say more
Yeah.
about that as a tool.
I guess that's my feeling, is like noticing that a novel is, first of all, I mean, I've written a lot of nonfiction books, so I've been able to really observe the difference between the way people interact with my novel and the way they interact with my nonfiction books. And my nonfiction books remain mine. Like, people interact with me about it, like, you're sort of the expert, and thank you for telling the story, but it stays my story. But there is some magical way that when you write a novel, it becomes other people's stories. It's not mine anymore. And people tell me about their Father Joe, and they tell me about their Alice, and they tell me about it. Like, these characters take on and inhabit and embody the imaginations of other people in the way that my nonfiction really never has. And now that could just be my, how I write, but I'm really fascinated by that. And I think that that is the path in a way, is the sort of embodiment. Like I had to enter and cross into these emotional realities that were not my own and try to figure out how to express them to the reader. And then the reader takes them up and wrestles with them and finds a path through them and then perhaps passes it on. And so I think there is a way that fiction allows that movement because it requires so much of the imagination of the reader. And so that's one piece. But then I also notice with some of the work that Native Americans are doing around Indigenous, the experience of boarding schools for Indigenous people. There's a title or a headline, that's why I'm stumbling around it, where it says Indigenous boarding schools, and it makes it sound like the boarding schools were run by Indigenous people, but it was the opposite of that, right? So anyway, boarding schools, where there were Indigenous children, and all the symbolic work that they're doing. And it also reminded me of an interview I did with this amazing pastor. He lives somewhere out east in Maryland, I think in Baltimore. His name is Heber Brown, and he's a Black minister who works on something he calls, I'm not going to remember right away. It's a farm movement. So his observation was that the most amount of land that Black people in the United States own is in their churches. And if the churches could plant gardens, then the people who are in those churches would have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, which they otherwise would not have access to. And so he started this Black church farm movement to get gardens in the churches. But what he discovered, and I thought this was so interesting, is that a lot of Black people have a lot of trauma around agriculture. And so they can't immediately, they left the South or went north to escape the land. And so this idea that they should suddenly be tilling and plowing and caring for the land brings up all of this generational trauma for them. And so he was finding that in order to even have the movement, he needed to bring healing through ritual to the people and their relationship to the land. And so that's something else I think about. I think that sort of seems to be what the people who are working on this boarding school healing movement are finding as well. That it's not enough just to know the facts. It's not enough just to list them or to understand how many children died here and how they died and who killed them and all of those kinds of things. That's not enough. What's needed is something else, and where that symbolic or ritual space can maybe open it up.
I think it's a couple of things that I loved about the book. One, I love the end of the book where you give all of these resources and talk about, is it nice books or nice? It's a movement where people write. I can't remember. I went straight from this book to The Price of Free Land, which is about South Dakota as well and Native issues. And so
Maybe it's in that.
It might be.
Mine was Boarding School Healing Project is the one that I was pointing people to, the Boarding School Healing Project.
Well, yeah, and there's that. And well, anyway, let me look at not right this second, but I love that part. Maybe it's in the other one. Maybe I read the end first in that book. I cheat sometimes.
I do that. Sometimes I read a whole book backwards.
Yeah.
I don't even know why. I just start at the end and I don't know what I'm doing.
Anyway, so that's an interesting thing that's other also happening. Maybe it's that she talks about it in the other book, but at any rate, one of the things that I thought was beautiful is when Bear goes to stay with the older gentleman, Gail. When he goes to stay with Gail. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more about what he was doing with Gail.
What did they do?
What did they do? And how, and clearly he was healing, right?
Yeah.
And through that experience. And I think that's what kind of and one thing that came up for me when you were talking about this And I love the whole idea that if you can get up high, you can find things. And I really feel like those kinds of things, in healing from, sexual abuse and maybe even healing generational trauma, one thing that occurs to me is that what you were talking about, going back and telling the story as though it's, instead of telling it backwards or from the back, you start from the beginning and tell that whole thing. I had an issue, so I never had a really particularly wonderful relationship with my father, but I came to understand him so much better when I told his story. And it helped me to release things. When children talks about removing scales or armor from your heart, it helped as I was telling his story, and not just, oh, and he was in this and he did that, and then but from his point of
Yeah,
view.
You have to imagine yourself in
Yes,
there, and you
yes.
have to say, okay, if I was at this inflection point, what would I do? Or how would I be? Or how would I, so yeah, you really have to cross some boundary in yourself to let yourself feel your
Right.
way through somebody else's experience.
Exactly, and I feel like that happened a lot in the book,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's sort of, can you say your question again, that, it's about, you were talking about generational trauma and,
Yeah, well,
how do you
what
find
language,
words?
yeah, what language was found in your families? And yeah, I guess that was kind of my question.
And I think that's how I found words, because I found words for him. I don't think I necessarily found his words, but.
Right, no, and you can't, right? You can't find his words. I remember, Jamie, so Gail is this older man who lives on the reservation and who kind of provides a sort of spiritual wisdom, depth, whatever to the people. But I remember I just had one scene with him. It was just that scene at the beginning when Father Joe drives up in his car and visits Gail on Sundays, after he's done visiting everybody else. That's the only scene I had. And Jamie was like, what? That's it?
Yeah,
That's
me
all
too.
you get? Like, what? No, you can't just give me this guy and then not like go anywhere with it. And so I was like, okay, but I don't know a whole lot more, Jamie. I don't know. I don't know how to find this person. So then I had to sort of keep searching, keep exploring. But I didn't know really what they would do together. I mean, I just didn't know. It felt like a screen there, like a barrier.
Well, I'd like to hear that book.
Yeah, I
I'd
wish I
like
could
to
write
see
that
that
book.
And then the other thing that struck me so much was when Bear did the dance on the street corner in Sioux Falls, and the description of how you did creative, how he was so focused in the dance and very slow, and that was just, to me, very awesome.
Having a baby, do we know
Those are
that she
also
has had it?
for healing,
Mhm.
definitely,
Yeah,
and clearly insight, right?
yeah.
It's just so beautiful, I thought.
Another one of those moments for me was when Alice sings,
Yes,
and she sings to kind of almost like call Sally back to life through her voice.
yeah,
That felt, to me, those two moments kind of felt similar.
It's interesting, you're both talking about relaying the facts of somebody's history, like your father, and I'm thinking about my parents both had, very difficult childhoods. And I know the facts of those childhoods and I can picture what they went through. But when I was younger and they both have been gone for over 20 years, when I was younger and it never occurred to me to say to them, how did that make you feel?
Right.
And so I can only get what they experienced from my imagination of how it must have felt. And I wish so much that I had that tool to ask them, how did that make you feel? How did you make it okay to live like that? And I just, it never occurred to me. We didn't share a lot of emotion, and I wish now that I had
You
done
could at
that.
least try. right? You could just at least try, at least ask the question, even if they couldn't answer it or they
Well,
couldn't,
never, but the way I was raised, we would
you would
not
not have done it.
Right.
delve into that aspect of, I was a child, they were the parent, I would not have said. Might say to a friend or somebody now, or as an adult, but when I was younger, I would never have said, how did that make you feel? And that's where I might have gained more from it, gained some insight and not be just passing that on, maybe.
Yeah,
If they were willing to talk
If
about
they
it.
were willing. My father, as he got much older, did share a couple of things that, but it wasn't a conversation. It was more him saying something, sharing a feeling,
Mm.
but it wasn't a two-way. Do you know, I didn't have the tools to do that.
yeah.
I think that complicates sexual assault and that very thing. And talking about it,
Yeah.
children don't necessarily have
The tools.
the tools or the courage or the power. They're disempowered.
I've heard the saying that children on an emotional level know everything that's going on, but intellectually they misinterpret all of it. So they carry forward, they know, they got the emotion right, like whatever was happening, they know what was happening at an emotional level, but they tell the wrong story and then they carry that story forward. So they have the wrong story with the right emotion and that creates, and I think that's kind of right. Like we know these things, but yet.
And I think too, if you're gonna talk about something painful as a child or even an adult, you have to commit to, there's gonna be some emotion
Something you
here.
don't want to hear.
And I think, I know for probably a lot of our families, nobody talked about that.
Right, right.
No, there was no words and there was no nouns, no verbs,
No
nothing.
adjectives.
No.
No, my grandmother had an adjective. She called her father-in-law a dirty old man.
Oh.
That's it. That, no story around it, no explanation. She just said to my mother, he's a dirty old man. And that's it. Like, that's it. But now that's been passed to me. So now what do I do?
Well, the
With
things that you
this.
know about a dirty old man, you would
I
make
now
a story out.
construct now, yeah, I'm a novelist, right? So now I got some fodder, but yeah, it's like this process of
Yeah.
going back. Those are the words she found. And to her credit, I guess she found some words, but
And she probably relayed something either in the way she said it, in addition to the words, to your mother. And your mother didn't have the tool to say, why do you say that?
Just tell me more.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We so often don't do that in our families, right? Tell me more.
Right.
Or until it's my parents are in their 90s now. Now I can ask them, and they don't really remember.
Wow.
Too late.
That must be part of the biological makeup. Like it must be like somehow we all miss this moment.
Well, they remember things differently. Do your parents do that? Well, not anymore.
No, I don't know.
But they remember things differently than you do.
Well, yeah, it's the same thing, I think. I mean,
Yeah.
it's, what is it? The play, everybody you can see a same event. Three different
Right.
people Rashomon, yeah, so you can see the same event and 5 different people will tell the story
Right.
completely differently.
My sister always puts herself in situations where I'm absolutely sure she was not. But she was always there. She's always there. I was there.
She's the narrator.
Yeah. Happens every time.
It's like reading fiction though.
Yeah, it
We
is.
put ourselves in those people's places and it becomes part of.
Well, I think it's Pablo Neruda who said, memory is imagination, imagination is memory. Like really all we're doing when we remember is.
Well, that's why you read some books and you say, well, I do. If I can't relate to any of the characters in the book,
Yeah.
I have given myself the grace later in life to not finish a book. I used to feel like I had to finish a book, but now if I'm reading something and I can't relate to any of them, there's no emotional connection, I'll probably just stop reading the book. And I'll try and try and try and then say it's not happening. And I don't like to do that.
Because empathy is, I think, one of the reasons we do this, why
To
we
put
go through the
yourself in somebody
practice.
else's
Yeah.
position and
That's where the work is so
understand.
important. as a tool for cultivating empathy. I remember in one sort of crossover, I mean, maybe partly because it is historically based, right? The novel, that it can offer this, but I remember, speaking about Holocaust education, my first experience, I had been to Yad Vashem, at the Holocaust Memorial, not before it was a museum in Jerusalem, but when I went through the DC Holocaust Memorial, and you get the car with Daniel, age 9, and you walk through the exhibit in his shoes.
Yeah. It's almost like you write your own novel as you go, and the experience of empathy and connection, and it's so powerful.
Yeah, so it's an interaction, and you talk about the layering that, is where you have, right, you have that, in that case, the sort of visual images combined with the statistics, combined with the Nuremberg laws in the history, allows you to experience it.
Yeah.
And that's where the empathy comes from, moral imperative from that, and that's where a story can do what a history book or cannot do.
I remember reading about one of my favorite novelists is Toni Morrison, and one of my favorite novels of hers is Beloved. And I remember reading an account of a woman who was trying to get Beloved banned from her son's high school's classroom because her son was having nightmares after reading it. And I thought, that's wonderful. Like, you should be proud of your son for having this experience, for being able to enter into this emotional nightmarish reality and live through it, and then have it affect him deeply enough that he actually has nightmares. Like, we should be celebrating this. This should not be a reason to ban the
whole
book.
point, right? Her discomfort with her son experiencing deep emotional pain.
Yes.
And being unable to protect him from that.
Right.
Which, right, it's because she can't do that.
Close to her child.
So you
Those
don't
are-
talk about.
Right,
Absolutely.
that's where the silent
Yeah.
Yeah.
combination, right? Maybe you don't have the words, maybe you don't have the fortitude
Right.
to engage the emotional discomfort.
And then maybe you want to prevent your children from having
Right.
to experience it because you couldn't face it. Why should, I don't know, but I just felt like such a missed opportunity. Like, this is wonderful. You should be praising your son. You should be complimenting him on his deep
She
heart.
didn't understand.
But she didn't understand the value. No, she didn't understand it. at all.
Where else she was living in such fear at some level of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so terrified. Yeah.
If we were going to confront these ideas or these questions through a Musar lens, what would we, how would we, truth comes up for me.
Right.
And any other,
I'd like to learn more about Musar because I know somebody who attends when she's in this country. And I don't know much about it, but it seems, a little bit I've gathered, it seems like it's something I'd like to attend. I just don't know much
Yeah.
about it.
Humility, probably,
and
because you'd have to face things that you have to learn. You have to allow yourself to reach a place of learning. What else do you see? Fortitude. I mean, we've talked about that. Courage.
justice, I suppose. I'm thinking about faith right now and deepening faith. And I was wondering how that might be, and I think perhaps, so I want to think about it, because it's interesting that you brought up Musar and this,
Yeah.
and then I was like, well, what if I thought about those two things at the same time? That would be
Yeah.
interesting. But the idea of a faith that there is, not only is there the sins of the fathers or whatever visited on the next generation, but also that there is a redemption for that. And it's not inevitable, would you say?
No, I wouldn't say.
And it seems like it is
Yeah.
fanning out in a way and dissipating.
Is there a redemption? I mean, I feel like for South Dakota, is there a redeemed South Dakota? You know, like, is there a path? I don't know.
Is that, what is it, Teshuvah? Sort of,
The teshuvah, the redemption process.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at, there are 4 stages or aspects of teshuvah. Right? The first one is acknowledgement, that's the truth piece. The second one, which I think is the heart of what we've been talking about, is feeling regret, right? Engaging the emotional, having the nightmares, right? What would this be like to have been in the basement?
Right. Yeah.
And equipping ourselves in the next generation, right, to prevent the perpetuation of inherited drama, to feel the pain, the emotional pain that would come with knowing this kind of abuse. And then there's resolution, sort of vowing to do differently, and then reparation.
I guess we kind of want to do it backwards, don't we? Kind of want to start with reparation and then move backwards. If we just skip that feeling part, just we could just skip that part, right? Let's just, I don't know, like, I think Father Joe has that experience at the end of the book where he's like, couldn't we just roll all this up and just, give them back their land and we'll just go wander off? And
Right.
couldn't we just do it that way? And, but that's,
And then there's that regret, but, okay, so you're just regretting.
Yeah.
But nothing happens.
right. You don't move on at all.
Nothing's changed.
No,
Has anything changed? I
no.
don't know. Doesn't seem like it.
Amy, I was thinking about honor, honoring the experience. And I think, Father Joe does that. He honors the experience of Alice and other people, and Gail and other people in the book. I think that's something that I would talk about. The other question I had is, there's this St. Joseph's Indian School, and I was looking it up, Chamberlain, South Dakota, that still exists. And we occasionally get like a charity request from them with a dream catcher and all
I do
kinds.
too. Yeah, I get the whole package. I'm like, why are you not sending me all this stuff?
Why does this school still exist? And if you look it up on Charity Navigator, it's not a good place.
Oh,
And
that's
so
interesting.
it's still happening in South Dakota. This
Yeah,
school
right
still
there.
exists.
Yeah. Yeah. The St. Francis Mission School became a tribal school. I can't remember the name of it. And then there also is this academy that started up, that's a Jesuit academy that the guy who keeps emailing me about it says, he feels like really good work's being done there. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure, who knows? I don't know. I really don't know anything about St. Joseph's, but I have a visceral memory of it that is not positive, but that's all I can tell you. It's like, it's something visceral, but I never researched it. But yeah, I also get the dream catcher and all the things, and it makes me mad every time.
Did you ever hear of the Herd Museum in Phoenix?
Uh-uh.
The Herd
heard
Museum,
of
a number of years ago, we lived in Arizona for a few years and came back, of course, but they had an amazing exhibit in Phoenix. There's a very long road called Indian School Road, and they had those schools there. And the Herd Museum a number of years ago, their main exhibit was about amazing photographs and then written sections about the history of the Indian schools in Arizona, and it was fascinating. And I don't know if you haven't heard of it, you can probably look for information for the Herd, HEARD, the Herd Museum.
I think there's a lot to be said for just allowing ourselves to be open to the story and to the history, and just to allow, because I remember listening to this podcast about South Dakota and Minnesota, and about the massacres that took place on the border between South Dakota and Minnesota. and how that history was covered up and completely disappeared. And yeah, I mean, that was my experience of it, right? That it was not there. But I wonder, I really feel like my interaction with the land would have been different if I had known, and if people had instructed me on how to interact with these sites where these massacres took place. If I had understood this is a place, where, like, I don't know if anybody's been to the Sand Creek massacre site out in eastern Colorado, but I've heard stories about people making that pilgrimage all the way out there. I've never made it all the way out there myself, but getting all the way out there and really having a perception that comes from the land itself, like as if the land starts to tell the story in some way. And that's my experience of Rosebud. Like when you go there, the land starts to tell you about this place and what it means and its pain and its suffering in a way that just thinking about it doesn't. There's some way, I feel pretty strongly, there's some way that the land is talking to us about these things, but I wasn't at all trained in hearing. And I think that's what I was trying to get at with Alice too, in the rocks. She can hear the rocks in a way that I cannot hear the rocks.
Did you go into the 2 buildings that had been abandoned?
They were locked up and
Oh, you could
boarded
get
up and
in.
stuff. Yeah, no, I didn't go in, but I also didn't want to. I felt repulsed. I felt this like wave of,
Well, I'm wondering, you talk about going to the land and learning from the
yeah.
land. I wonder if somebody had access into those buildings.
I wonder if part of the healing movement, will eventually be to like surround the buildings and talk to the buildings
Yeah.
and, maybe dismantle the buildings in the long run, but not without some kind of healing process. And they seem to be sitting there waiting for some sort of healing
But I
process.
think a lot of that will stay in the land like you're talking about.
Yeah.
So even if they remove the buildings,
That's right.
there should
And
be some
even if all the white
acknowledgement.
people go away,
Yeah,
that, it's not like you can just extract the
Right.
pain.
So maybe what you're talking about is kind of like what your class about the Shoah and the layers of
Feeling and
yeah,
history and
maybe
yeah.
going in and taking it apart, and maybe
Yeah.
that's part of the
Yeah.
process.
And I think part of the process is too, like in that woman that I met at the museum who was like, you can't take this precious thing away from me. So part of it is maneuvering, that people had different perspectives on this thing. It wasn't all one thing. It wasn't, people had a feeling of salvation from this school, and generation after generation went there, and whatever. I mean, it's so complicated. So it's got to be an honoring, just to bring back Marilyn's word, but like an honoring has to take place.
Mhm.
That's about pain, but not only about pain.
maybe some people are afraid of some kind of commercialization
Oh,
of
for
something
sure.
that they feel is maybe sacred isn't the right word, but so private, and they don't want it so terribly exposed.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that, the fear of what will they do with this history?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that white people in South Dakota are particularly honorable holders of history, right? So I would be afraid of that. I know on Rosebud, there's definitely a feeling of like, maybe you could just leave us alone now, like maybe enough.
I don't want to keep you too long. It's about 10 after, maybe just a few more minutes. And one more question around the silence, right? One, that there weren't the words. 2, that it was just too ugly to confront. Talk about that it was perpetrated by the church.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know. So there's so many layers there. I think for my second novel, next one, the one I'm working on now, there's also a historical trauma. There's also sexual abuse. So it seems to be these are my subjects. And there's also religion. So it's all there, but there aren't any Catholics. So I keep joking that my first novel is about West River Catholics and my second novel is about East River Baptists. But it might be just the same novel, the church, I can't quite get my mind around this. So I don't really have a great answer to it at all. But, and I read this book, somebody gave me a book about, that was written by a nun about why the priests were embroiled in sexual scandal in a way that the nuns were not. And she tried to explain this. And I found the explanation absolutely unconvincing in every way. So I don't feel like I understand, except from the basic level of like hierarchy breeds corruption. That part I get. When you have absolute power and you enforce that power and you use that power to oppress and silence people who are under you, you create conditions for abuse. That part I get,
What about the second tectonic plate?
which is,
It was also. a
oh, that
refuge,
it was also a refuge. Yeah,
And the
yeah,
only place where you could go
to get
where-
food.
to get food, to receive compassion, to, that preached about.
Yeah.
What you want,
Yeah,
the values and the
yeah.
love.
It's this, like this, I think at the end of the novel, Bear says he sees through two eyes. And it feels like that to me, like seeing through two eyes, or maybe this tectonic plate thing is working a little better for me right now. But these two movements, this one movement that said, we're here. We are not the government. We are here to care for the people. The government is the one who's abandoning the people. And we're here to care for the people. That was an absolute part of like the Jesuit mission in South Dakota and the Episcopal mission in South Dakota. They both were like, we're here to care for the people. That's what we're here for. And I recently heard about the bones of Jacques Marquette. Jacques Marquette was this priest who traveled through the upper Midwest in the 17th century and became absolutely beloved of the tribal peoples who lived in that region. I mean, so that when he died, they carried his body back to their homelands and buried him there in great honor. And then maybe 50 years after his death, something like that, his bones were dug up and half of them were carried away and nobody knew where. And then it turned out that I don't know how they had mysteriously reappeared in Marquette University.
Oh.
And so this priest, this is recent. So this priest, I guess, oh no, I don't think he's a priest. But anyway, he negotiated very delicate operation between Marquette University and the tribes in this upper Midwest where the bones of Jacques Marquette, where half the bones of Jacques Marquette were left, to reunite the bones of Jacques Marquette in the indigenous
That'd be a great
location.
movie.
Isn't that great? But anyway, just made me think, the memory people had of Jacques Marquette was very precious. Like they'd held it over many, many, many generations. This was a very beloved person who they had honored. And they were devastated by the fact that half of his remains had been carried off someplace else by somebody who knows who. And so there was this delicate move to reunite the bones. So I don't know if this is a story about the stories, about how, I don't know, about how the relationship to the reservation changes people too. I mean, it's not just the church changed the reservation changed the people who came there to serve, to live. And I don't think we hear that story too much either. But that's my Father Joe, but he's like been changed by this.
True. Part of the land grab too, I think, from the United States government was by allotting Lakota Sioux land to the church. That was part of the land.
Yeah,
grab.
right?
Wasn't just,
Yeah.
Oh,
1,000 ways to
here.
just carve up the land so that
And
there was no
they-
actual autonomy or authority.
They wanted, to separate the different families so they wouldn't glom together. That's really-
And also, I mean, and it was churches, because the Lakota reservation actually was given to the Episcopalians.
Yes,
So it actually wasn't even given to the Catholics. So the Episcopalians were the ones who were allowed to go in and set up missions there, not the Catholics. But then there were still Catholic outposts and all of that. I mean, whatever, but yeah. I don't know. I guess I don't know how to answer the question eloquently. I just feel that, I take Alice's own religiosity very seriously. She's a Catholic. She's a Catholic through and through. She goes to daily mass. Sometimes she's the only person who shows up for daily mass, at Father Joe's little church. And I take that very seriously. And for myself, there was a formation. I mean, when I was in Sioux Falls as a young woman, there was a movement around, led by this wonderful Episcopal priest named Martin Broken Leg, to create really Lakota-based rituals inside the Episcopal Church. And I was really formed by that. I mean, I would go always whenever he'd have, he'd be doing his thing. And I just thought it was kind of amazing how you could integrate. And he was really very serious about that, a very devout Episcopalian priest, and then working to integrate that with Lakota traditions and practices and chants and language and all of that. So I was really moved by that. And I think that's still very active and alive. And a lot of people, have mixed identities, and I think you see that with Alice. She knows very much the traditions and the ancient practices and the things going on with the peoples. And she knows how all that works. And she also knows how the church works and her place in it, and she tries to integrate those things too through aesthetic practices and
Her beating.
and her beading
That
and
was beautiful.
yeah. And that's the kind of thing I learned, from him.
One thing I found horrific, actually, and it goes to this idea of redemption. The whole idea that when they talk about the priests and the confession and how they could be absolved instantly.
Yeah.
I can just sin and then go to confession
And
and
have it absolved and then do it again.
exactly.
Yeah.
That there's such a huge misuse and I want to say abomination
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
the way that you use that was just, I feel
Yeah.
that this.
And then that story that it's the people who are wrong and they're offering them this great gift of reconciliation and redemption or whatever. Yeah.
Well, and Father Joe he had all the secrets. He had to keep them because I guess you take an oath or something.
Yeah, right.
And you
It's in the
have
vows,
to
right?
keep that forever till you die.
Yeah, like a sin eater in an Irish.
In a sin eater, yeah.
Ugh.
Well, let me just, I want to do a little advertising. So I do have my books over there and all of them. And I also wanted to, there's some flyers over there for 3 events.
Oh.
That one of them is happening here. And you can grab a flyer, but here's I'll just tell you. This is a Discover Your Spiritual Autobiography retreat that we're holding here at Beth Evergreen, February 21st through the 24th. So it's Friday night through a Monday morning.
That's the Friday after President's Day weekend.
Yes, I think so. I
Yeah.
think that's right. And so here's that flyer and you can grab one.
That Amy's,
And I'm leading,
Melissa,
and then, my friend Melissa and I are leading that. And we'll
Yeah,
be
I'd like
taking
to hear
people
more about that.
through a process of telling their story, telling the story, their own autobiography, but through the lens of spiritual growth and development and interaction and stuff. So we'll be doing that. And then in Leadville, so I don't know how interesting this is for anybody, but in Leadville, we're going to be leading, Melissa and I, a workshop on going from an idea for a book to an actual book and then publishing it over 16 weeks. We'll be leading, it's 8 sessions over 16 weeks from your big idea to a published work. So we'll be doing that in Leadville.
Are you doing that in person only?
It's going to be in person only, yeah. But still, just want you to know that it exists.
Fun.
But Leadville's fun.
It's 16 weeks.
Yeah, but it's every other week,
No.
every other week for 16 weeks. So it's like the second and fourth Friday or Wednesdays of the month.
Cool.
And then we're also leading a retreat in Leadville. This is in Twin Lakes, at the Mount Albert Lodge. It's called Wild Woman Retreat. And so I wrote this book called Wild Woman. And so it's about finding your inner wild woman and allowing her to lead you into your own, to an deeper spirituality.
which took you through Egypt.
It took me Israel and Jordan. Yeah. So my book about it is over there, but this is a retreat that we're offering. And there are flyers for this over there too. So retreat we're offering in June this year. It's like a hiking and we'll do some writing and hiking and time in nature and exploration of your own spiritual path there as well. So those are the 3 things.
Can you,
Sounds great.
can we look at that?
Over there,
over there.
they're over
No,
there.
you have
So,
to go
yeah,
over there.
feel free to, this is just a photocopy I made on my own
Okay.
on my computer, but I made some actual flyers for you, so.
And
That's awesome.
Amy, are you, so the books that you
Yes.
have out, are you leaving them
Yes.
here so that we can?
Buy
Or what
them.
were your thoughts?
My thoughts were, if you wanted one, I would sell it to you tonight.
Okay.
And, yeah, but I can also leave some if you think. But then that might just make, I don't know if that makes
Yeah,
things
I
too
don't know.
complicated for him.
Yeah,
But yeah,
Or
Nighthawk is
somebody.
20. Wild Women is 20. Some of them are 10. If you're
Can I
interested, just
see
ask me, I'll tell you the price.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
thank you so
Oh,
much.
I got a question.
Yes.
So
This is-
you guys can, if you want to stay.
They can go to bed now?
When they make the movie,
Oh,
I have a
yes.
suggestion
Yes.
for Father Joe.
Oh,
So I was seeing him as, what's his name? Michael Sean Leonard.
oh.
He was on House. He was House's friend. I don't know if you ever watched House.
I did,
No.
but I don't remember.
I'm gonna look it up.
He was also.
Michael Sean.
He was also in Dead Poet Society when he was a young fella.
Oh.
So he's a lot older than.
Well,
now.
see, better keep this in mind. Amy.
Yeah.
Sean. Yeah, when they Winters.
No,
No.
as
Prairie. No.
Leonard.
Sean Leonard.
Thank you, friends. Thank you, Riley.
We're finding
Well,
the.
friends, have a
Okay.
great night.
Oh yeah, that's totally, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm starting.
I love it.
Not Sean.
I love it.